Good evening. I'll call the Planning Commission meeting to order. It's Thursday, September 20th, 2018. It's 6:33, and we are located here in the City Hall at the City Council chambers. Good evening and welcome. The first item of business tonight is the roll call. I better get a pen. So I'll start on my left.
Eric Brooks.
Jane Garrison.
Shanna Collins.
Mark Boffman.
Okay, so there are 4 of us present tonight, which means we have a quorum. We're missing Rituja and Nyapure, Larry Crandall, and Roisin O'Farrell. Roisin and Rituja, I believe, are at, it's curriculum night for schools. And Larry is in Montana. So we're dealing with kind of a family emergency. So it's just us tonight. And the next item of business will be the approval of the agenda.
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed say no. The agenda is approved 4-0. The next item of business is the approval of the minutes. And I don't have any changes. Does anybody else have any changes?
I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the minutes from September 6th, 2018. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed say no. So the minutes are approved 4-0. And the next item of business would be the public comment for non-agenda. Is there anyone who'd like to speak tonight on a non-agenda item? Mr. Stickney. Oh, and he has props. Oh, sweet. Literally.
Thank you. These are going to be a recap of the 2 meetings with the City Council. You guys did an awesome nut and shoot.
Thank you.
I'm going to put my dinner on.
Right.
And nut
Oh,
chocolate.
dear.
Wow.
Mr. Stickney, I'm starting to worry. We might be like, isn't there some sort of limit on the amount of things you're...
5% dark, anything over.
And low cost, way under $25.
Okay.
All
Just
right.
making sure.
My name is Paul Stickney. I'm at 22626 Northeast Inglewood Hill Road. And this evening I gave you a folder and a candy bar prop of an awesome nut and chew and a little packet of nutcrackers with 4 picks. My summary off the bat is, because the comment's a bit ad-lib, it's going to cover 2 council presentations on September 11th and the 18th, where I gave a part 1 and part 2 of how to bridge polarized housing divides within Sammamish. And if you get a chance, when those meetings are online, which may not be off the bat, but when the September 11th and 18th meeting are online, you can see my roughly 3-minute presentation both of those times. In your packet, there are 4 sets of relatively short sheets, materials. One is an email that I sent the council on the weekend, Just Tell Me, that really lays in clear terms positively what the issue is about changing the land use in the comp plan for housing and economics and what the advantages are. Number 2 was the first part of a 2-part presentation I gave the City Council, where I gave them a box of 4 nuts and chews and talked about this 11-page sheet. And the key message there was, everybody in Sammamish that has a real opinion on growth, that is informed on growth, is nuts, passionate, in love with with their, position, but at the same time, they think anyone else who does not agree with them is nuts. So what we have to do is we have to break open all those nutty positions on growth, including mine, with the chew. And the chew is to ruminate and think. And that's about adding 5 things that the city has never had to inform housing choices over time. What are statistically valid surveys of what people want? What are true housing gaps, which is the difference between how many households and how many houses there are for each economic and demographic segment? What are the pros and cons of meeting those needs and wants? What are the consequences? And what is fully informed consensus? Last statement, I suggest you make 2 T-bar charts for yourself. One, outlining numbers in the current comp plan, and 2, outlining the numbers as I suggest, and make a list of what you think is more advantageous for the community, the pros and cons of those 2 long-term outcomes. And if you'd like to chat about it, feel free to give me a jingle.
Thank you, Mr. Stickney. Okay, if there's no one else who'd like to speak this evening, the next item on the agenda is old business, and tonight we will be doing a work session on the urban forest management plan. So I believe we have the Davie Resource Group here tonight, and so they'll give us a presentation. We have the draft urban forestry management plan that we've all had a chance to look at, and so I was going to give him a chance to present, and then the 4 of us can go one by one and sort of give our overall,
First slide.
just sort of comments. I think at this point during the process, we're looking for really broad statements and broad input on, are things in the right place? Are they going the right direction? And later we'll kind of get more into the details. But I think that's what they're looking for tonight, is for us to give them an idea. Did we kind of hit the mark? So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Goodman.
Thank you, Chair Collins. Good evening, Commissioners. David Goodman, Senior Management Analyst with Community Development, and I'm pleased to be with you this evening to discuss our first draft of the Urban Forest Management Plan. And I'm joined to my right by Ian Scott of Davie Resource Group, who's been with you a couple times before, and who's the main author of the plan that we're looking at tonight. So I'll give just a really brief introduction, provide a little bit of context about what we're going to be speaking about, and then we'll get right into hearing your feedback. Next slide, please. So as you might recall, we were last with you on this topic back in June when we discussed all of our public engagement efforts, including the public opinion survey, our outreach events and workshops, as well as our photo contest. And if you're not aware, we actually eventually teamed up with the Arts Commission to create a photo exhibit of 20 of the photos that were submitted through that contest that's currently being displayed in the lobby here, and that's going to be up for another couple weeks, so I'd encourage you to take a look both down here and upstairs. So we're currently in the draft development stage of the plan, and we are excited to hear your feedback on this first draft. To give you a little bit of context, we're reviewing the first draft tonight. The next time we'll be with you later this year, we'll be talking about the strategic recommendation and implementation plan, which is a document that'll have some more concrete steps relating to action items and implementation steps for the goals that are included in this first draft. So tonight we're talking, and I'll get to this in a second, tonight we're mostly interested in, as Chair Collins mentioned, higher level feedback. Is this generally where you want to see the plan going? Is there anything that we're missing, or is there anything that's in there that you don't want to be in there? And then we're gonna then take that feedback and return to you later this year to talk about some more specific ways that we can implement those goals that we hopefully reach some consensus on today and with the City Council in a couple weeks. So next slide, please. So as mentioned, we're looking for high-level feedback, and I have just a couple examples of the type of thing we're looking for. We want to know whether you feel that the draft, the first draft adequately addresses the current status of the urban forest, whether we've reflected the challenges facing the urban forest here in Sammamish, and whether we've reflected the community's vision for the urban forest through all of our public outreach events and activities. And then finally, we want to turn to the goals, and we want to ask you, do you feel that the goals that are in the end of the plan that are going to be what we're going to implement after the plan is adopted, do those address adequately all of those things that come before it in the plan? So do we have the right amount of information? Do we have the right information in the plan? And do we have the kind of looking forward, the goals looking forward that adequately will address those things? So that's the type of, go back. That's the type of feedback we're looking for, and Ian, our content expert, is here to help with any specific questions. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to the commission.
Okay, who wants to go first? Jane, start us off.
I have a list of things that I wanted to go over on this, and I think David copied them off, and we can hand those out to people. That would make it easier because we can follow it. So when I went through with this, I just thought how wonderful it is that the city is doing it. And I think normally our surroundings are taken for granted, and this is above and beyond from what I usually deal with. When I got to page 36, it rates canopy fragmentation at the bottom of the priority list for receiving sites. And recent studies have shown that with global warming, we are seeing forest edges become stressed and die. They're more vulnerable than the interior part of the forest. So it seems like if we need to help the existing forest as well as find a place, well, perhaps those edges are good receiving sites. And the map on that page, or on the, I think it was that page, shows a huge patch canopy, which means it's perforated and it's not continuous. And so there's lots and lots of edges all over Sammamish. And a lot of it is in home ownership areas, not in parks and public areas. So what I was wondering, if we could add climate change as a consideration earlier on in this plan, because climate change is what's causing those edges to suffer. On page 47, we finally get to climate change, and it seems to me that it would be the basis for much of our tree loss. And I know it's not fully understood, so it's kind of a hard thing to address early on, but I would like it to be mentioned earlier and then be flexible so that as people learn more, the plan can be updated and be flexible in the future. On page 51, policy EC 10.8 needs to be a high priority to help combat climate change. It concerns the retention of trees in clusters or with a continuous canopy. And it's pretty low on the list, in my opinion. That's in my opinion. EC 10.11 has a very low priority for preservation of landmark and heritage trees. And recent studies have shown that the loss of these old, large grandmother trees can interrupt mycorrhizal and microbe exchange between old trees and young trees, resulting in the death of younger trees. And this only creates more patch canopy and more unhealthy edges. So, and that's a very low priority, so that concerned me. Is it okay to go on and finish this? On page 54, I think we need to add dead tree for permit types. I had a dead tree, a huge giant dead Douglas fir, and I took pictures of it and sent them to the city. And the guy at the desk, or whoever received it, said, get an arborist. And why would you need an arborist for that? You could see what it was. It was hazardous, it was dead, it was gone. And every time I came back, it was get an arborist. And then finally, they said, okay, you can take it down, but you have to replace it with other trees. And here I was suffering from the loss of this beautiful big fir, and I think that was wrong. So I showed them how many plants I have put in, how many natives I have planted on my land, and I didn't have to eventually, but it was a fight, it was a battle. And I think if the poor guy at the desk, now I feel sorry for him, he's not an arborist. And when he gets this thing and it says it doesn't have dead tree as an option, he's going to go to another option. So it's got to be there. On page 68, goal UA1, could you expand the key areas under item B? Perhaps promote a contiguous canopy. Say, these numbers are just hypothetical, but say 300 feet of lakes, streams, or wetlands, or perhaps 200 feet from landmark or heritage tree stands, or perhaps 100 feet from arterials. We could do it from man-made things, or slopes over 15%. This would give us much more possibility to have a contiguous canopy, which I think is just crucial to the survival of the forest for as long as we can have it. Goal UA2 is to promote resilience, develop guidelines for homeowners to use for vulnerable forest edges, such as things like mulch. Is that a good thing to do? Add nutrients or microbes, is that good? I don't know. More trees, or maybe understory plantings, or perhaps water in the summer. We need to study the trade-off between loss of water and loss of canopy, but suggestions for people to help create a healthier edge environment for forests in their own yards. And generally, what I would like to say is that people think there is an endless supply of species choices for each ecosystem, and they would be shocked by the few that are available. I think the future will show that we have to depend on resistant man-made varieties and keep up with the changes, just like we do for human health with stem cell research, et cetera. The old lists are so outdated, they're just unusable. They probably still have birch on them, and we know about the birch borer. So we can't, they have all the old species on them that are sick and dying, and we can't use them anymore. So we definitely need an arborist employed at staff level to take the pressure off of planners and homeowners alike. The subject is far too complex to be taught in a course. That's what I think. I felt obligated with this one to say what I thought.
Very good. Thank you, Jane. And you guys have these, so makes sense. Okay. Commissioner Brooks, Commissioner Boffman.
Yeah, I could run through some of my markups. First of all, I want to echo Jane's comment about the great job, and it's a lot of stuff brought together here, so it's a wonderful start for sure. I think there's a lot of things to build upon. Certainly highlighted the fact that the community character kind of equals trees. I think that's a pretty well widely accepted thought for sure. I guess as I go through here, I think that most of these things might be some things that I could kind of address offline. It might be great to have like a western red cedar tree. You have these tables like on page 12 that talk to you kind of have a handful of different species and talked about what they bring for ecological and stormwater value. Cedar might be interesting just to see as a comparison since they're pretty widespread. I think that maybe talking a little bit about heavy metal uptake that trees and plants do kind of help with the stormwater quality. Maybe talk a little bit more about the lifespan of some of these trees, like the big leaf maple. I understand they have about an 80-year lifespan, and knowing about that and how that, when you start replanting and understanding how long it's going to take. It was interesting in here to know it was about 17 years for a tree to actually become a viable, mature tree. Right. Yeah. So when you start thinking about turnover and things like that, and if we're counting on these urban forests for some of those kind of ecological benefits, that if it takes 17 years to do it, and we're losing big patches and we're replanting, that's great, but it's going to take 17 years for that patch of trees to really do anything for us. We might look at how we remove trees differently, perhaps. I think there's a lot of good findings in here that'll help us retweak some of the tree regulations, like Jane was speaking to as well. Yeah, I think it's interesting the amount of money that's kind of being, I guess, saved, you could say, by air quality and stormwater benefits from the urban forest. I think that's something we should really let people know about. And I guess I would end with I think it's talked about the importance of education, but I think we really need to make sure that the community understands this. There's some numbers in here about how many people are aware of it, and it's a little confusing. I don't think that the numbers are supposed to add up to 100 because they don't, but I just wonder a little bit about it. If those respondents, it might have been, could the respondents been people that were maybe more interested in trees versus people that aren't, and those people are then naturally more aware of the regulation than people that aren't. Mm-hmm. I get the feeling there's a lot of people that don't know about the regulations because I see a lot of things going on. It's like most people are good people, and if they know about it, they're not going to top a tree and do these things that we know are illegal. So I think educating the public is good. And then one of the last things is like the town center, some of the percentages of the coverage, and the town center parts, they have these pretty big canopy coverages, and we all know that that's going to go, not likely going to remain. So maybe have some asterisks or something like that and kind of quantify that so that, you know what I'm saying, people look at it and might expect something that may not be realistic. And then talking about how canopy is maintained when you lose large tree and you're replanting with small trees. you know, what does it mean to maintain it? You know what I mean? You're not truly, it's a dynamic thing. So it's not a static thing. So you might have a little bit more one year and you have a development, and it might actually go down, but then it comes back higher than it was before or something like that. So kind of helping people understand that dynamic aspect. I think it's wonderful to see where it's the priority levels of planting trees are, and it would be interesting to get a little bit deeper into how those priority areas are established. Of course, we have steep slopes and water quality. There's some message or some talk about it's important to kind of high-profile ridge lines to have trees there. I think that's a good idea too, but that's more of an aesthetic thing versus something that's benefiting wildlife, for example, is another theme in here. And I don't know that we really know where these wildlife corridors are. Where are these things that we're trying to make better? I think for the most part that covers the majority of my kind of what I come across. But overall, I think a wonderful effort. Thank you.
I had just a couple comments. There's a lot here, right? And that's fantastic. I think that's useful. Taking the step of doing this is really important for the city, and looking at the fact that we're, you know, on the list being more proactive than some, it appears. I think that's great. So my concerns are general in nature, but one of my general concerns is about specificity. And I don't know really if that's the appropriate comment about this plan or not, but I worry when I read through some of this that there's a lot of great ideas, but they don't drill very far into the specifics of what you would do. So for example, you know, there's some good stuff about public education, but there's not a lot of details about how that might get implemented. And maybe this is not the right place for it, but having said that, I worry that a really good plan with a lot of good ideas ends up in a binder up on a shelf and nobody ever does anything, because there's not a lot of specifics that have been discussed that could result in actions. And there's a few throughout here. There's not none, but you know, for example, tree planting, there's a lot of discussion about tree planting. Who's going to do that? How's that going to happen? We could talk about tree planting forever, and if nobody is tasked with tree planting, or there's some specific program that says we're going to utilize volunteers or something, it feels like a great and vague goal that doesn't result in an action. Enforcement. You know, I've always had concerns about the city's enforcement of the tree retention ordinance, and I think a lot of folks have said to me, how can that possibly comply with our tree retention ordinance? And I've never really understood how that gets actually enforced in the field or not. When a developer has a plan and they submit it and we approve it, does somebody go out there and check it? Does somebody check it before it gets approved, right? I mean, so we can say enforcement, but unless we have teeth to that and have a specific plan of how it gets enforced. And the answer to some of these things might be a suggestion of hiring staff. I understand that. And we can choose to hire people or not hire people. But at least if that's the right way to do it, we should consider putting that in here and say, here's what we've got to do if we want to accomplish this goal. Because otherwise, this just becomes paper that's kind of meaningless. I think that I would like to see, and maybe this is in the education, but a little more of the idea of engagement of the community in implementation. I know that there are groups within the community that are very passionate about trees, very passionate about, you know, landscaping, preserving plants, on and on. There's a lot of energy around this particular topic. There are some topics where there's a couple of people and they can only have so much bandwidth, but around this topic, I think there's a lot of folks who would be very interested as volunteers or participants somehow. I think that should be perhaps considered a little bit more. I also just recently, like earlier this week maybe, had a similar comment from somebody in the public as what Jane said, where he came in, he had 5 cedars die on his property, and he was worried that there was a problem And he came into the desk and said, or no, I think he called on the phone, either way. And he kind of got the same response: we can't help you. Now, maybe if it's on private property, that's the right answer. But I think we need to develop a better way to respond to that, because if we care about the overall canopy of Sammamish, which is a key feature of our city, then perhaps a better response than we can't help you and we can't do anything for you. I'm not sure that really, if we're spending the money to develop this plan and going through the process and the details of reviewing it, and then the best we can do as a city is say, sorry, I don't know what to do, I can't help you because you're on private property. I'm not sure that's a good reflection on what the goals of this plan are. So just kind of a general idea that, I forget what the percentages of the tree canopy is on private property, but more support for that seems like a key element. And I'm not sure that really means money, but just providing better resources to people. Here's a list of approved arborists, call one of them. I don't know, something like that would provide better support to private property owners. I like the public education. I think that needs more specifics, because public education, you could go through and you can talk about all kinds of things in the city, and part of the goal is public education. And we struggle to communicate with citizens in the community. So I think if you really want to make that a serious topic, there has to be more meat on the bone for that one. I also think that one of the things about a plan like this, there are people with who go nuts about this. So there are people who are very passionate for this stuff, for the trees, for preserving the trees, and then there's people who are kind of at the other end. And if you have a plan that has chinks in the armor or things that can be attacked or questioned or whatever, I think you have to write a plan like this from the viewpoint of, this is what's realistic. We're writing it from the center. So, for example, I know that I can't see this very well on my iPad, but I did look at it last time you presented it, and I looked at it on my computer, and a lot of the areas, in theory, that you could plant trees were places like my front yard. Mm-hmm. I'm not planting trees in my front yard. I have trees in my backyard. I have trees in my side yard. I'm not going to go plant trees in my front yard. There were places that were targeted to plant trees that just didn't make any sense. I think it's important to make sure that what's in the plan can be received by everyone as that's a reasonable approach. That's something we could accomplish. It's not too far into the realm of unrealistic. And that's a very vague statement, right? I recognize you're going to sit there and go, well, that doesn't help me very much because I don't know what to change about the plan. But in the end, you got to look at it, I think, with the viewpoint of somebody who's a little bit more skeptical rather than somebody who's an advocate, and adjust the plan to address them. I've seen people in the neighborhood, they cut down trees. And I'll say, well, why did you cut down the trees? You moved to Sammamish. Oh, I know, I love to see the trees. I just don't want them by my house. Well, that's the person we need to get to if we're going to do anything about private property, and enforce the permitting process and start to make it so that the citizens understand what our priorities are and why, and many of them buy into it and participate. So overall, tons of great information, right? Fantastic that we did this. I think it was probably long overdue for a city like Sammamish, where the urban forest is the key feature or part of the character. But I'd really like to see some more specifics, if it's reasonable and possible, suggested in here, kind of a little bit like, I hesitate to say it, but a little bit like the housing strategy. The housing strategy has the big ideas, but it also includes, and here's some thoughts about how we might implement. And I think really it'd be great to see this plan have that, if that's a reasonable request at this level of development. Thanks.
Commissioner Buffman, I'm really glad you brought that up. And from the beginning of this project, we were very cognizant of the fact that we didn't want this to be a plan that just got adopted and then gathered dust on a shelf somewhere. We want this to be implementable, and we want this to be kind of a commonly used touchstone for all the things that the city does with trees. So as I mentioned before, we do have coming to, in a couple months, the strategic recommendations and implementation plan. And that is the document where we're going to get to more of the specifics like you're talking about. Today, we really just want to know it sounds like you're in favor of the public education piece. So really, we just wanted to know, before we started getting into specifics, whether you agree with this approach, and then we're going to take that feedback and come back to you with a lot more specific implementation steps for those types of things. And at those meetings, we'd love to hear your feedback about what specifically you'd like to see happen with that. Today, we're mostly just focused on, yes, we support public engagement. Yes, we support increasing and promoting resilience in the urban forest. And next time when we come to you, we're going to be looking a little more specifically at those things and how do we actually do that. So that's definitely going to be a big part of this plan. And again, from the start, we wanted this to be something that is usable and dynamic and doesn't just kind of go away as soon as we adopt it. So I appreciate that feedback, and looking forward to discussing that with you in a couple months.
So just the parallel to that, I guess, is that if we look at it and we have too many things on there, we need to be prepared to let some things go. I think that's a hard thing, but as we start to say we want to do X, Y, and Z, I mean, just a simple math equation that says we'll need to hire another 50 people, okay, well, that's not the right end result. So I would just encourage you, keep an eye on part of making this realistic and usable and not just a plan that sits on the shelf is making it the right size for what we want to accomplish.
I think really good comments from all the commissioners. And I don't want to lose Commissioner Boffman's comments because who knows if he'll say them exactly like that next time. So hopefully we can keep those comments for the implementation portion. And, Commissioner Garrison's as well. These are also very specific, but I don't want to lose any of these, so let's keep them close as we go through the process. I echo what everybody says about how wonderfully the plan is put together. I really appreciate all the information in it, all the ideas. I agree with Commissioner Boffman. It's like there's so many ideas in here. If we did a third of these things, we'd be in such a better place than we are now. So it's nice to see. And my actual favorite, I'm going to say slide, but it's not a slide. It's this matrix on page, it's page 55. It's page 53 of the actual plan. And it's performance levels, and it's low, moderate, good, and it says where we are now, and it says what you look like if you're low, what you look like if you're moderate, what you look like if you're good. And I don't know, to me this just says a lot about where we need to go, and it's easier for me to read than the goals. So I don't know if we adopt some sort of method like this for each goal. I'm not sure, but I don't know, just a thought.
Sure. Yeah, no, I as my first moment to speak here, I want to, thank you all for your generous and helpful comments. As David has said, there's two bulky parts of this document: the what do we have and what do we want sections in general. We're looking to make sure we get buy-in from you folks that that content there is good, so that we can sculpt and revise the goals to something that some of it may wind up on the cutting room floor. But as you saw in that matrix, there's a whole dearth of areas where the city can excel in. So when we take a look at the goals, the indicators for a sustainable urban forest in that table, they talk about a bunch of different subject areas or management areas. But we kind of present the goals in terms of, how to improve the urban forest asset, how to improve the city's efficiency, and then, how to better engage with the community. So pieces such as Commissioner Garrison suggested about improving some permitting, so that that is simplified, or adding staff. We try to put those into one of those three categories, so that they, even though they kind of spread across, between, like say if you add a city arborist, you have better community relations, but you may have more efficiency of operations. We've kind of picked a spot to put those in. The comments about town center, I think, how you said, I think the town center canopy is more at risk than others. That's sort of new information for me. So I'm hoping that we can circle back with that a little bit. Did I hear that right? Because we did go through an exercise there to talk about the potential for development. We asked the city's GIS department to look at all the properties that could potentially be developed, and what would happen if you had no we put in there, if we had no regulation and everybody and all the developed properties were developed, this is how much canopy is at risk, and we wanted to have that kind of context in there to lead towards the goal. So if there's if the canopy in the town center is at risk, then we want to. I don't want to say risk, but there's planned changes there for that canopy.
I'm not making any claims in that regard.
Okay.
Because when I read in here that the canopy study was based off 2015 aerial photography. So with that in mind, that largely was undeveloped that time. So any kind of canopy assessment that's there now is not likely to remain. But if there's been already some adjustments to take into account future development, then that's great.
Okay.
That's great news. But they seem to be rather high canopy coverages. I can't seem to find the table, but in some cases in excess of 70% or something. And
Right,
maybe that's
right.
the case for the kind of final build out, but I found it not necessarily easy to believe that, but might warrant some checking in or checking up or verification.
Okay. Another item that I wrote down from the feedback of this session here is to maybe, besides talking about climate change, in putting a little more emphasis into the document about the relationship there. Mortality rates, they're not really well understood in the city, and that's not uncommon. Most cities don't know, how many trees are nearing death, or from the canopy analysis, there's, I think, 9% of the canopy is considered in poor health. That might be representative of the mortality rates, but what we may wind up proposing as a modified goal is some simplified permitting, but permitting that gives more information to the city. So when a homeowner comes in and says, I have 5 trees that are dead in my yard, the city would collect that information. They may not be able to pay to go solve the reason why those trees are dead, but the city does want to know and would be adding that to the list of the change that's happening out there, and so to be able to maybe take action if necessary. We'll try to get those kind of things into the next version of the plan as we get feedback from the city. Your feedback, of course, will get consolidated with
Right.
the other commissions.
I have another suggestion, and it's on page 31 of the actual document. It's page 33 of our packet, and it's the map that illustrates the priority planting opportunities.
Oh yes, yeah.
I really like this. And I know there's an interactive display online, right, where you can go in and you can see these maps better. So it's not like we need better maps. What I'm thinking, though, is maybe after this page, we could maybe do 1 or 2 examples, like a zoom in of one of these priority planting areas and kind of show what it would look like if you added trees. I don't know, sort of like a landscape mock-up or draw-up where just so you can get a better picture of what does it look like to have an area that's high priority, and then what does it look like to sort of solve the problem. And
you guys have provided actually some interesting feedback, which a couple things that struck me with the results from this canopy assessment. One was that there isn't a lot of opportunity areas, regardless of their prioritization. There's not a lot of found open canopy places in the city compared to a lot of other cities we work with where they have 30% tree canopy or 25% tree canopy. They're finding a lot of properties, homeowners that have no trees in their backyard, no trees in their front yard. Here in this city, most properties have trees. Mm-hmm. Some of the very high areas, if you zoomed into detail, a lot of them show up in areas that are, view opportunities for homeowners. So along the eastern Lake Sammamish, say, it would be readily apparent I'm looking at you, Mark, if you may find homeowners coming to this and saying, you know what, there's no way you'd ever plant trees in my yard, given this as the metric. So what we're trying to get across is that there are places where trees could be planted in the city, and through the implementation plan, it would be defining how would you as a city prioritize based on this information plus the fact that some of it's on private property or some of it's in a view property, other issues that may prevent those locations from being planted. One of the priority planting areas is the meadows out in this adjacent to the city hall here. And I think most people would recognize that may not be a place that they want to have trees. So we put this map in to show the potential, but we don't want to take away from the fact that there's other factors in the decision as to where to plant a tree. This just sort of presents the opportunities, because at the moment the city and staff mostly work reactively to find opportunities to plant trees where they kind of know they exist. But now we can look at the city as a whole.
I appreciate that. Oh, go ahead. I have one more. Let me finish, and then I'll open it up for like the second round. Summary consideration. So there's also this piece. It's page 36. It's page 34 of the plan. It's page 36 in our packet, and it talks about. It's the city and the decision makers can set a target canopy cover goal to pursue, and it just lists these sort of bullet points about what the decision makers can do, sort of like what's on the table. Mm-hmm. And I really like this, and I think it gets lost where it's at, and maybe it needs to go into the, or maybe you just need to repeat it at the end, kind of after that performance table, when I think you have like a summary of findings at the end. That might be another place to put this. For some reason thought that seemed really important, and that we might want to either move it or take pieces of it and put it at the end so that it doesn't get lost.
Sure, yeah,
I don't
okay. Our intent with these were because, as you guys have admitted, there's a lot of content in here. And so at some point, at points in the document, we try to stop and summarize.
Right.
So these were supposed to be the summary conditions about what we know about, the summary considerations of what we know about the urban forest, the asset itself. And then the following, further on down, we get a summary of all of the municipal operations in a subsequent sort of conclusion. But I think it's a great point. We'll take that under consideration, whether because there's page 51, I think, of the document. We have summary conclusions as well. There's a few different places where we can restate for emphasis purposes, and we want to be careful not to
Right.
create overwhelming content.
Right.
Well,
what I think about is that we all read the whole document, but we're probably the only people in the city who will read the whole document. And so, it's like, besides city council members and parks commissioners, besides the people who are really looking at this. And so, most people are going to read the first few pages, they're going to read the summary, the executive summary, and then they're going to jump to the end and look at the goals, or, jump to the end and look at the summary considerations. So just that's my thought, is that make sure that some of the other pieces that are important throughout get to that space where they might be read. And that's actually it for my comments. So I can open it up again, Commissioner Brooks.
Thank you. I'm trying to stay high level and not dip down in the weeds, so to speak. First of all, I think that the approach, this what do we want, where are we at, how do we get there type of thing, right? I think that's an important approach and almost like a mantra that we could apply to any of these things that we're working on, whether it's housing or whatever. I mean, you've got to know where you're at, what you got, and you establish where you want to go and all that kind of good. So I think that that's a big, high-level, important thing. Some other questions about looking at stormwater value, for example. It's great that you have two identical identically diametered trees, one coniferous, one deciduous, and can one make the assumption that the stormwater value for the coniferous tree is higher because it's doing that job all year round? And it might be interesting to kind of maybe highlight that too within here, because as we start making the decisions on canopy again, what is it doing as a functional thing?
We do want to be careful how we emphasize the values of trees as they're introduced in the document, because they are provided there as examples, and a lot of cities are, and I think we put it as some of the goals, is that the city could take the step of, say, inventorying its city street tree population and then running those through a model to identify the stormwater benefits, and they would be a lot more specific to the city of Sammamish, rather than this sort of introductory model that we put in one specific tree and the zip code and get some results. There's more robust features in that model that aren't getting leveraged because we just don't have enough information from the city to model it yet. So what I'm hoping for is that the city will sort of accept that these models exist and that these are ways that we can put economic and environmental values attributed to trees, and from there further study, be able to actually set goals based on the benefits of trees. So the city can eventually get in a position to say we want to have this much carbon sequestered every year. We want to. That's as far as I've got as an example, but you can get more specific measures besides canopy as a goal. But I wanted to call back to Commissioner Garrison's suggestion too about the trees around lakes and streams as setting canopy goals. I think that's a wonderful idea, because you can really set canopy goals based on like canopy goals for specific parks, and this is where we get closer to the implementation plan. To say, let's achieve certain canopy goal near parks, or let's try to achieve a canopy goal within the southern area of the city, or any kind of those kind of goals may make it easier for people to recognize, hey, I'm in that area where we're trying to change the forest in a certain direction, and people would be more willing to participate and engage. And so I think that was a really great idea.
I think the value of the urban forest comes from education of the public, for sure. So having those kind of scientific functions that these trees, that's one of the things that came out of the initial tree retention ordinance, was there was this realization that these things are doing something more than just kind of an inert stick in the ground that's keeping the sun off of me or keeping my view from me. They're doing a lot of things that a lot of us didn't even know they were doing, and then after you do that, you start looking at them differently, and I think that's a big, important step for kind of engendering the value.
If we look at, or go ahead, Jane. Do you have something? Go ahead.
I was just going to comment on something Mark said, and that was about people being afraid to come in after they get the initial shock that they have to hire somebody and do plans and do all kinds of stuff to cut down a dead tree. I just think that's, I have neighbors who would never come to the city. They just sneakily cut them down. And we're on TV, aren't we?
We don't know where you live.
It's not uncommon. That's a challenge, yes.
It's just we need to be encouraging so that these people are willing to come forward and work with us, and to do things the way we've been doing them is just wrong. It's working against us. So I think that's just super important to get people on board.
I agree.
I think one of the more, go ahead, sorry.
One other thing that I remember I had thought about when I went through here, and correct me if I'm wrong, But I don't, so this city, there's some debate about this topic, but this city is actually, it's hard to argue, I think, that the city is in a development mode, not in a stable mode. And I don't see a ton in here, or maybe I went too fast and I've talked about development so much I don't pay any attention anymore, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot in here about addressing development. And that, I think, for example, the town center is an example of that, and what are we going to expect as the town center gets developed, and what's really already in code and ordinance that we don't need to worry about. I don't see a lot of that. Obviously, long plat, short plat, new developments. We have tree retention requirements, but I, off the top of my head, don't know what the tree planting requirements may be, could be, what's in the ordinance. Seems like that would be a reference point here. And there's other things, sort of tangential, but like TDRs, or somebody that comes in with a docket item and they want to upzone. Shouldn't the tree canopy have some footing with some of those kinds of things, that as part of the transfer of development rights, you agree not to cut trees down, or you create additional buffer here, or not things that would be burdensome, but it feels like, since this is a key piece of our city, that should somehow be more connected with some of our development components, because that's a big issue within the city. It's a big issue for citizens. It's unlikely to abate. I think we're going to struggle against that. So maybe more of a focus on that somewhere in here. And I'm not encouraging making the plan longer, but I think that's a hot topic for the
there
city.
was the section that we talk about development as it relates to canopy, and there was actually. We went with an assumption of a basic tree size in there, and so if you guys after this conversation read into it and you go, I don't really like your methods there, please call that out, because again, that's as we move towards the second draft of this plan, we want to have full buy-in on some of these what do we have type discussions. And so in terms of development, I think we also brought in the goals. I know I can't point to the specific goal, but there was some discussion, the thought of potentially, taking goals, your canopy goal in consideration of a person's management of their property. So if they're, if they have one dead tree on their property, but they're showing that they've got 80% canopy in on their property, maybe they can enjoy some streamlined permitting down, in the future. So it's not just about whether one tree is being removed or maintained, but whether or not their overall management of their property is meeting, a city's objectives for sustainability. And so having some of these measures in here that the city now has access to, you could, down the road through plan implementation, maybe look at changing some of the permitting processes to accommodate that. I'm thinking of the larger landowners who may have very large properties. If they were to come forward and say, like a golf course, one of the golf courses, if they came forward and said, we have a 10-year plan to, remove 20 trees a year, these are the trees, and got a city's approval, they wouldn't have to seek a permit every time. They would just be able to implement their plan for the management of that property. And I suspect that there's other large properties in the city that, might be able to get on board with something like that. And again, reduce permitting and the costs associated with that.
I think Shanna wants to say something, but I'm just going to jump in here because on the construction topic we're on, we just wholeheartedly went after ADUs in our housing strategy. And in my neighborhood, which is in an old-growth forest, we have several properties now that are sold, and they're taking down heritage and landmark trees so they can put in an ADU. Now, which should dominate? That's a good question for me. When I think about it, is the affordable housing more important, or is that continuous canopy more important? And I think that's something that needs to be discussed.
Really good point. Yeah. And actually, I didn't have anything to say. I was going to just look back to these 3 bullet points on the slide and make sure that we hit all of them, thinking that our comments are coming to an end. But, Jane and Mark bring up really good points about tying in the housing strategy and tying in the docket process. I don't know how that works. I mean, David might be able to address that better than the actual consultant, just because those externalities are, circling. So I don't know how to do that, but
The pro plan.
yeah, and
Because I saw a couple
there
things
is a
in
thing on the
here.
pro plan in here.
Yeah, there's a
right?
couple of strategy, or a couple of, underneath the goals, a couple of things like the planting and tree holding area. I know that that's part of they're just trying to pick out a location for that. So there is some coordination to just double check, I would think.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, other than that, I think we definitely, I think we agree with the status of the urban forest, right? I mean, I think you depicted it pretty well.
Okay.
I was surprised to see, actually, I thought there were fewer dead trees than I expected. I think it's like 3% dead or dying. So that didn't seem quite as bad as I thought. Challenges facing the urban forest, I think we hit that pretty good. Except for maybe the housing strategy and development, if we need to boost that up a little bit. And the community's vision for the urban forest, I think it's pretty well represented. Does anyone have any thoughts contrary or agreeing?
I'm happy.
Good. Okay. Yeah, great first draft. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think we are not done tonight because I think we're having a director's report, right? So the next item, you know what? Do we need to have public comment on this? Jeff, should I do public comment first for agenda item? Paul, are you going to do public comment for agenda item?
I only have something real short, and I can do it after Jeff. Either is fine.
Go ahead, Jeff, then. You guys might want to turn to your long-term calendar while Jeff's getting ready.
I guess I'll make public comment. Good evening, Planning Commission. Jeff Thomas.
He only gets
with-
3 minutes. 7 minutes.
Put the shot clock on, see if I can do it in 7 minutes. Good evening, Planning Commission. Jeff Thomas with Community Development. A short director's report, specifically related to 2 things. I'll cover the calendar in a minute. What I'd like to cover first is a short update for you from our council meeting on Tuesday evening. The Planning Commission actually, I believe, held a total of 5 public hearings on Tuesday evening. So the meeting did go fairly late into the evening. But 3 of those public hearings were related to some work that you did earlier this year on concurrency and level of service methodologies related to traffic and traffic impacts. I am pleased to report that the council did take action on Tuesday evening on 3 separate ordinances. One amends our comp plan to make some changes related to those subject areas in our transportation element. The other 2 were code amendments in different chapters of our municipal code. So coming out of all that, and this is a very high-level summary, but there was some additional work that council has directed staff to pursue related to V/C, some road length segments for concurrency as well. So Steve Lezenchevsky, our Public Works Director, and his staff, I believe, are going to be having some more discussion with council here in short order on that, and we'll scope that work out and hopefully have that ready sometime around the end of the year for further evaluation and review by our respective commissioners and council members. So that's that. The 4th public hearing, I'm not going in order here, but the housing strategy update. The public hearing was opened for that. It got moved on the agenda a little later in the evening. I know there were Commissioner Garrison, Commissioner Boffman, and Vice Chair Crandall were in attendance. I'm not sure if all three of you were planning to speak to that or you were just there to observe, but I think you were all gone by the time it did appear on the agenda later in the evening. So Mr. Stickney, actually, our esteemed citizen, I believe was the only speaker at the public hearing on Tuesday evening, but council did continue that public hearing to a date certain of November 6th, Tuesday, November 6th, when they plan on reopening the floor to folks that would like to speak to the housing strategy update. So the last public hearing that occurred was a scheduled public hearing for consideration whether to extend the development moratorium in the city that has been on for almost a year now. And again, I'm giving you the very high level summary, but council did vote to extend the development moratorium, but they did provide a couple of additional exceptions for which development applications could move forward. Specifically, subdivision applications, items related to rezones that have been docketed for review, and development proposals within the town center that have an executed memorandum of understanding with the city. So the list is getting a little short of things that are subject to the moratorium, but I think we're moving forward with that, and we're doing some work behind the scenes to prepare for those changes, which will take effect on October 3rd when the current 6-month moratorium window comes to conclusion. So last item from Tuesday evening, at the end of the meeting, the council introduced some interim development regulations related to our zones primarily, and a few things affecting our commercial zones. But these interim development regulations were introduced and they were adopted by a vote of 7-0 as an emergency ordinance. So they go into effect immediately with an emergency ordinance as provided for under state law. And those interim development regulations will be good for a period of 6 months. I won't belabor you at this point in the meeting with the content of all of those, but we will send you some information on those via email so you can take a look at them firsthand in track change form. There's a few different sections of the Sammamish Municipal Code that are impacted by these, namely chapters 16, let's see here, is it in here? I'm just looking at some information on my screen. 1621A for sure, and there might be a few other chapters that are also affected. So we're going to actually, David Pyle and I will be back here at your next meeting on October 4th to actually provide you a presentation on those changes. So you can start to get your head wrapped around what they are, what they mean, and we, as staff, had worked with the former council in 2017 to actually get onto not only the community development work program and city work program, but also secure some funding from city council at the end of last year to do a much broader subdivision and zoning standard update. So that's been on our work program. We've talked about that a little bit. You've talked about it a little bit as part of your neighborhood character discussions in the housing strategy update. Some of this work that's been done, these interim regulations, maybe a good way to start thinking about it is rather than starting at phase 1, maybe these changes could be considered phase 0 of that much larger, broader effort. And we'll have time to get into those and start talking about them. And I think they will fold into some of the dialogue you've had here this evening a little bit with the urban forest management plan and how some of those development regulations interact and work together. So we look forward to that. So that is actually your program, your agenda for your October 4th meeting. David and I will speak to you about that some more. So last item, how am I doing on my shot clock? I can't see it. Oh boy, okay. So next meeting, October 4th. Interim development regulations, October 9th. special work session with our city council on a Tuesday evening, 6:30, I believe, to talk to them a little bit about the housing strategy update. We're going to, there'll be a few emails you'll receive in preparation for that session that we'll work with you on to, we're going to solicit questions from City Council and see if we can answer some of those, and also work with you for subjects that you would like to speak to specifically at that work session as well. So that's it, unless you have any questions of me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any questions? No?
Great.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I will now open it for, well, I guess we are receiving public comment, so Mr. Stickney.
Good evening, Planning Commission. Oops, got to turn this on. Oh, no, it's on. Okay, good. My name, Paul Stickney. I'm at 22626 Northeast Inglewood Hill Road. And I know you know this, but I have, I went to University of Montana Forestry School. So I have a Bachelor of Science in Resource Conservation with an emphasis in land use planning. Anyway, comments on the urban forestry plan. And if these are in there that I missed, I tried to read it all, but there was a lot of information there, so I don't have, perfect retention of an entire document like that the first time I read it, so I may have missed some things. I think there should be a range ends on the size of trees and the cycle of life of those trees. Is this going to, a plan, for example, for a Doug fir that can live 500 to 1,500 years of a size that is just massive? Or is it going to assume that those are taken down when healthy at around 150 or 200 years, so the sizes stay modest or not? I think all of the 5 or 6 main native species, there are more than 5 or 6, but the 3 conifers and the 2 broadleaf trees that were here, mostly on the plateau before man, which is the western red cedar, the Doug fir, the hemlock, and the big leaf maple and the alders. Yes, there are a few others, I'm not saying that, but how large do they get? How long do they live? That should be a part of a plan. I noticed in the plan that it mentioned no single species should be greater than 10%. True if we introduce non-native trees, not as true if we stay with the type of native trees that were here before man came. I think that's something to consider and to address. I noticed, but don't have a comment on it, in terms of having any recommendation. I noticed within the urban forestry plan you saw that there was roughly a 50-50 split between coniferous and deciduous trees. Is that a target to maintain or a target to change? And that's the question. I don't have that answer. I'm not sure what's the right number. So are we going to attempt to stay on that course of 50-50, or is there an advantage to moving one way or the other, is another comment. I think it would be really cool in the plan if there was some sort of, there were lots of tables and lots of matrix, extremely specific. All the GIS information the city has is just extraordinary. But I think there could be some real interesting aspects about slope, soils, and orientation. Is a slope facing west? Is it facing east? Is it looking north? What types of things grow on those aspects, and steep and soil type? And there might be some general guidance, not down into the weeds on every acre, but if these types of characteristics are in play, what is the recommended guide for the species and the mix and the ages in some maybe broad, large categories. Like maybe there are, and I'm just going to make this up, maybe there are 3 or 4 categories that cover 80% of the city. You don't have to worry about the other 15 or 20 categories that cover, 10 or 20%. And last, what are lessons learned from other peer cities in the region and or the state, and especially Oregon, because it's part of our Puget Sound sub-basin species, they call it, of this kind of fir hemlock thing that we have is in Western Oregon and Western Washington. What are the lessons learned from those cities over time, and maybe not steal, maybe capitalize is the right word, on some things they've learned and integrate those lessons, if we think they are appropriate, and we as the Kings, into the plan. So those are my forestry comments.
Thank you for your comment. Okay, I don't think there's anyone else left to speak tonight, so I'll close the public comment period. And next item of business is adjournment.
You do Larry's thing, he's not.
Not funny enough, right?
I move to adjourn tonight's meeting.
I second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed say no. And the meeting is adjourned at 7:48 p.m.